Hello, Mr. Floridi.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, fine. Thanks to be with us for this appointment. I introduced you, but I introduce you again because many people are arriving now. Luciano Floridi is a professor of ethics, philosophy and ethics of information at the University of Oxford. He's some way the father of philosophy of information and director of Digital Ethics Lab. So, Professor, while borders in these days, physical borders are some way closing, and also regions are closing their borders, so we are suddenly in a world that seems to be like the past century, a digital world. Also in countries like Italy, but also in many others where people were not so technological advanced, is empowering. That could be one, maybe the only good effect of this terrible pandemic we are living. Which are the consequences of this and the effects?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the very kind invitation. It won't take only half an hour to unravel all the consequences and implications. So let me try to be rather simplistic. I think we come from a time when, in the last few years, literally, when people started thinking that the state was no longer part of the game. In other words, about multinationals, perhaps supranational organizations, but the single state, the national state, was an old concept, something that belonged to the past century. Today, we see how important it is to have a national infrastructure, a national health service, a national sort of desire and governance behind fundamental politics due to the pandemics. So what the real changes are. It seems to me that there was a mistake in the past, and there's another mistake in the present, typical philosophical point. We thought that the state was no longer necessary, that it's not true, but we thought that in the past it was also sufficient, and then it's also not true. In other words, what we are discovering, it seems to me quite obvious, that the state is increasingly necessary and increasingly insufficient in the politics of today. It is absolutely necessary because that's how we citizens interact with the rest of the world. That's how we organize ourselves. But is it totally insufficient? And the pandemics is a clear, great, unfortunately, example, because unless there is coordination among all the states and supranational governance, a single state, say in Europe, will not make any difference. See what has happened to the UK. Boris Johnson thought that he could go solo in dealing with the pandemics. He had to change his mind quite rapidly, quite radically. So to summarize, the state is increasingly necessary, is increasingly insufficient. We're just discovering that it was obvious even years ago.
We can remember, and a professor of the University of Jerusalem, Eva Yus, is reminding in these days Michel Foucault theory about biopolitics, where health is at the center of the governance. So are we living in this dimension that is biopolitics, or more in the strange building of a new dimension of governance of digital that is colliding with these closing borders and empowering sovereignism in this moment?
Well, this is another great point, actually. Politics has many varieties. We speak about geopolitics, biopolitics, digital politics. I think what we're seeing today is the clash between these different trajectories of politics in a variety of ways, and the overburdening presence of biopolitics, in other words, health and safety, the ability of each of us to take care of our own well-being and the well-being of the people around us is, of course, at the forefront. However, let us remember that that does not mean that all the other chapters, economic politics, the sheer straightforward politics as power, but also digital politics are not intersecting this particular sort of kind of politics today. So I would like to stress that biopolitics today has become more obvious. It was always with us. Foucault had the great merit of making it, as it were, obvious to everybody. But it was obvious already at the time when Plato was writing The Republic. It's just that today is in front of everybody, is on the newspapers, is on Facebook. There has to be a novelty. It's not something that just academics are discussing in conferences.
Okay. We are building also in Italy, but everywhere in the world, the application for tracking people movement in the last 14 days. That is something we would never imagine if not in this kind of situation, something that maybe is more nearer to some technologically advanced society like Asia. It's necessary, of course. It's how does it match with privacy, and what should be important to do before building this application or choosing this application for our country in a way that we don't find ourselves in the future in a worse situation than in the present.
Yeah. Well, I think that, as you said, these are being developed everywhere. There are different kinds. That's the first clarification. There are different kinds of data management. We may be talking about overall anonymized or pseudo-anonymized population level analysis, which may help to understand the spread of the virus, for example, all the way down to, shall we say, a South Korean model where you have your own app, you might be informed personally about exposure to someone who might have had the virus, etc. Now, in between the very general and the very specific, there is a variety of strategies and policies. So that's the first clarification. We have different levels in our hands. And just to be clear, for example, we are currently, as we speak, literally, I had a meeting yesterday discussing the possibility of launching an app here for the NHS in the UK, etc. So which models you're going to use depends on the answer to two questions, since the first question has already been answered. Is it necessary? Well, it depends. Sometimes it's too late, so it would be an unnecessary breach of privacy. It just doesn't do anything to anyone to have that level of personal intrusion in my own life. But if it is necessary, and it may well be in many cases, then is it proportionate? How far do we want to go? It's not a yes/no answer, but there's a degree of, again, erosion of privacy. And the last question is, how long for? I think that the last question is perhaps the most fundamental. Sacrifices can be asked to anyone, especially in times of enormous crisis, enormous suffering, but they have to come with a best before kind of clause. You have to do this for the next 6 months, for the next 12 months. We will revise this in 2 weeks. If it is never-ending, open-ended, then we're not talking about a sacrifice. We're talking a change in regime, and that is very dangerous.
And why, after September the 11th, we didn't come back from all the measures that are invading our privacy? For example, when we are at the airport, also if terrorism is not so near now, it's not so an emergency.
I think there are at least 2 or 3 reasons which are actually going to play a major role in the post-virus stage of our lives. One is inertia. We all know bureaucracy keeps doing what is being doing, and therefore, unless you put some clause, some regulation on constraints, it will keep doing whatever it's doing. So people will, for example, in your example, will keep checking plastic bags and liquids in airports for the following years, for the rest of the life of the universe, unless someone says stop. So inertia. Second, it may well be that the threat is not entirely overcome. It might still be there. Now, in that case, imagine that we still have a viral sort of risk of spreading in about 6 months. We might want to renew the sacrifice, but that is a renewal. You have to ask people, say, are you ready for another round of difficult times? And I think that there's a third reason, which is it is convenient to some people, unfortunately, some circumstances rather than others. So imagine, I just want to crack a joke for the sake of a bit of lightness. Imagine I sell plastic bags at the airport to make sure that people can put their stuff in. And, well, it's all my convenience, and I will hope that they will never stop checking that, because otherwise my business is over. Now imagine my business is collecting as much information as possible about as many individuals as possible for as long as possible. I mean, it would be my convenience and my interest to make sure that this state of emergency never stops. So it is a socio-political decision, the one that says as long for as, or for as long as, or until, and then put a deadline. Now, no one says that you cannot renew that once you reach that deadline, but a deadline has to be there. And I'm a bit concerned, for example, in Italy, where some of the measures, perhaps because of a hurry up, because of the pressure of emergency, didn't quite say how long are we going to close the schools for, how long are we going to do this for. And I'm not saying, oh, it shouldn't be done, not at all. I'm just saying, look, unless you tell people, well, there's a sense that this could be never ending. It doesn't build trust, and it undermines confidence in the ability of the system to react properly once the crisis is over.
What's happening to Europe? Are we seeing and going towards a more united Europe, or are we going to destroy Europe?
Well, I have to say that I read all possible interpretations about this in great newspapers by great people. And let me start with a pinch of disappointment. There seems to be a tendency to have a particular view of what should happen and apply that to bend reality around what that will be the case. So I have a view that Europe it's rubbish, it should stop, get out of the euro, and therefore that is exactly what's going to happen. Or I love Europe, this is a great thing, and therefore that's exactly what's going to happen. So I think that that kind of sort of bending reality around my own preferences is not exactly good philosophy. So let's try to do the other sort of exercise. With an open mind, what could possibly happen here? And I think I would like to suggest that the most likely scenario is a polarization of what is already in place. Good, decent, strong democracies will probably get out of this a bit stronger, a bit more decent, a bit more unified. And therefore, in that, Europe may actually gain something. But weak democracies, democracies that are on the verge, or non-democracies at all, they will also be reinforced in their either weakness or strength in anti-democratic trends. So China, for example, will come out enormously reinforced. But so could be Europe if things are taken advantage of. And the last comment, if I may, some of the commentators that I see around, they seem to be thinking about the future as if it were something written, like a book. And you just have to look carefully and try to guess what the chapter says. There is no future that we have not written today. So all these opportunities, a stronger China or weaker China, a better Europe or worse Europe, they're all open at the moment. That is what a crisis is about. It wouldn't be a crisis if you weren't opening a number of opportunities. So I would warn anyone against that's the future kind of people, or against those who, on the one hand, on the other hand, when what we really need is a plan for today, that all the opportunities we have at the moment, the opening up, leads to a better Europe that we want to build. There isn't a good Europe in the future unless we build it today with what we have today. So a bit of construction and a bit of a project would be really very welcome today.
You always say that cooperation is mostly for bad. I mean, we have criminal organization and we don't have organization for good. Could it be the moment? Could this moment be the good one to cooperate also among countries that are traditionally enemies, like China and US, or US and Russia, or US and Iran?
It is a possibility. I think it's just a possibility. I'm not sure it's very likely, because once the crisis is over, we'll probably go back to some of the classic sort of straightforward political positionings. A China that wants to be recognized and wants to regain or gain even further its primary role in the world. A Russia that is on the back leg and feels increasingingly irrelevant and therefore increasingly assertive, probably in a military way or aggressive way, especially on one side of Europe. A US that has lost direction, both in trade, in internal policy, in terms of sort of liberal democracy and the promotion of it. So I think that we'll probably go back to some of these stories that we have already seen these days. The cooperation and coordination of efforts, especially with the crisis that we have just accidentally delayed a little bit, thanks to the virus, meaning the environmental crisis. Well, that which has been delayed by the virus, thanks to the fact that basically the world is now closed down for business, well, that will be the next crisis will hit us immediately once we are back on our feet. Will the world coordinate and cooperate as it is doing now for that crisis? Yes, but, and mind my words, I don't really like what I'm going to say, it will probably happen because there will be another major disaster. That's when we get together. We shouldn't. We should think ahead. We should plan now. But I do not trust our way of sort of dealing with future problems. I'm afraid that only the pressure of some major disaster right there, round the corner, will put the countries once again back together to defeat another enemy, which is global warming.
We have seen different kind of leadership in all the countries, but who's been the best leader for this pandemic and what we have to learn by the way our politicians behave?
I think that your question presupposes that we have some good ways, or we have seen some good ways of dealing with this. And the most disappointing aspect of the Italian crisis, perhaps, is how little all other countries have learned from what has happened in Italy in advance. It's almost like being told, days, weeks before a disaster happens, before, as you were, the train hits you, that the train is coming. And yet no one moved. Now that, I'm afraid that is not entirely an answer to your question, but it's more like a comment to your question, would have required some serious, high-level, high-quality political insight. We are so short of that everywhere, especially in Europe, not only Europe. And I'm also talking about, of course, the UK. So if we had had some very good politicians, then those politicians would have been able at least to take advantage of the Italian disaster, the tragedy that happened in that country, and say, look, no, this is coming our way. We better do something here. And here are the measures that we want to put in place. We haven't seen that. And so Italy was unprepared, first in line. You can't blame Italy for it, but anyone else behind Italy had been warned, and yet nothing happened, not in time. We're back to the previous point. Until the disaster, the crisis, hits you right in the face, we seem to be unable to take measures. This should change. The new political class of the future will have to be a political class that can think a little bit more in the long-term horizon and not just looking at their feet. If they could do that, then we have a good chance of a decent Europe and a good fight against the virus and the other problems we have, social inequality and global warming included.
My last question, then we pass to the questions of the public. We have seen just 1 month and a half ago Ursula von der Leyen investing 100 billion in 10 years for building European platforms to have the governance of digital and not depending on US or China. Now we are at the point that we are asking and answering, but we will have a China Marshall plane or a US Marshall plane to help us. And what's happening that US platforms are everywhere. They get into our education, into our companies. We don't know, we are accepting everything, each term and condition. We don't know where this data will go. And we will have probably suddenly the 5G from China. So Europe, from a digital point of view, is finished. How we could come back from this situation?
Well, I think that, as you said, business models are both changing and growing immensely in some corners and suffering immensely in some others. As well as sort of the balance between different political forces are being reshaped. So these are all quite obvious. It's a bit more difficult today for Europe than it was just yesterday to have a leading role in a world post-virus, where a stronger China, perhaps a weaker America, and a more confused world will be looking everywhere for leadership. I say a little bit more difficult. I didn't say impossible. Once again, there is an important distinction between technological development, innovation, economic power, and the rules of the game, governance. Europe could contribute enormously in terms of good governance and good sort of legislation around the governance. Now, I'm a bit skeptical when I hear politicians in Europe talking about millions of euros or billions of euros going into industry, management, entrepreneurial projects, building this, constructing that, because normally that money is hugely wasted. If the state intervenes in economics, it does normally a bad job, but it can be enormously supportive in terms of infrastructures, absolutely. In terms of good legislations, definitely. In terms of support for individuals and families, all the way straight to the individual. So we've been talking about, once again, and I'm one of the people who has actually argued in favor of some direct contribution to the pockets of European citizens. That is money that goes a long way. 10 million or 100 million or 1,000 million euros in sort of glorified immense projects, the likelihood that are going to be wasted or not used efficiently, effectively, is huge. Now, look at what's going to happen in the United States. Again, we're talking about an immense, the biggest ever stimulus provided by US government in its history. And how much of that money will go to the usual pockets or nowhere, in no pockets whatsoever, just wasted. Now, that is my concern. A lot of money is not whether we should do it, but how we do it. And once again, Europe could have a leadership. Now, you might actually get, and I stop here, from all I've said in answering your questions, that I have quite a optimistic view about the opportunities and a very frustrated view about our ability to grasp those opportunities. If only we could be sufficiently smart to raise to the challenge, Europe would have a great position, and so would Italy within Europe.
Okay, now questions from the public. That data should be managed from private contractors or directly from public companies?
Well, we come, depending on when you are in the history of the internet and so on, I'm old enough, as you can tell from the white head, to remember that when we started, and we're talking late 80s, early 90s, we were very worried about the government. There were no companies around, so we were absolutely concerned and defending privacy against governments, but because the memory of what governments have done with our data, it's living memory. It's not that the state has, or public companies or companies owned by the state have such a good record in terms of how they line up their citizens. I mean, remember, 1984 is not about companies. So we were coming from there, and then all of a sudden we found a second problem, which was not the usual surveillance. Wasn't just the state. The ownership of data was also shared, as it were, or increasingly shifting towards the commercial side. So do we want to have problem of a socio-political kind, the state, or problems of privacy, nudging, intrusion, etc., on the commercial side? Well, there is a third way. It's just that we're not taking it, and I'm not quite sure whether we will. But it's an ordinary socio-political solution so that we do not engage with ownership, but with the regulations of the game about data. So when it comes to companies today, I mean, we've never been so much online, and I'm not talking about on life, really, literally online. We're sharing so much more. We are saying yes to anything. We are accepting all possible contracts and regulations.
So, a question from Mr. Andrea Pontremoli, professor of Business School University. It's probable that Italy will lead the coming back of normality. How do you suggest to communicate, and which should be the first things to do in your opinion?
I wish I had those answers on the tip of my fingers. It is true that having been the first, there is a good chance that it might also be the first to come out of the crisis. If that is the case, I think that one important element here, and I'm aware that I'm saying things a little bit too abstract, forgive me, but we should really start looking at a different way of organizing our economy. We are still too dependent on sort of 20th century industrial production of things, and if we could start moving increasingly towards understanding that the 21st century needs an economy of consumption, for moving more towards the highlighting the concentration on where the added value is in a country like Italy, well then that would mean open for and to business again in a short while. Now, Italy could and should come back from the crisis as being a welcoming country, not just because of our history, the beauties that are all over the place, environmental, cultural, artistic, historical, but also in terms of what we need in a world that is increasingly old. Remember that Italy has a very old population and fewer people who can take care of it. That should ring a big bell to anyone who is rabid about immigration. So a country that is open to the right kind of working people, the right kind of people who want to live in Italy, and is open to innovation in a way that is worth the 21st century, so an economy of experience and not an economy of things. I think that would be quite a remarkable way of leading the pack, as it were, in Europe. Once again, it is an opportunity. We shall see whether we can take it.
Should universities in the UK criticize the government's early response to the crisis? Why they haven't done if they didn't?
There was a huge response from the universities. In fact, there were letters signed by hundreds of scientists to complain about the strategy that had been initially adopted by the government. And I don't want to claim that that robust expression of skepticism was the only factor that determined the change in politics. I'm sure that the first sort of tragic deaths also made a big difference. The realization that it was an insane approach looking at what else was happening in Europe. But I'm like to think that the voice of reason did play a role there. Again, you just have to Google to find both the letters and the people who sign it. So there was, I would like to say, a strong response to the very questionable initial strategy adopted by the government. And I'm quite proud of what colleagues did there.
Do you think Asian countries will take advantage in the global scenario once crisis will be finished?
Oh, yes, but they're not the only ones. Anyone will try to position itself as a winner here. Countries...
Amazon?
Including non-countries, companies, supranational organizations, but also nation-states that can see an opening here. Imagine for a moment, which is not science fiction, that the cure, whatever that is, maybe the solution for the problem, one way or another, maybe technical, maybe biological, is provided by China. What kind of changes are we going to see in general politics? So I would say that everybody's positioning itself for the race that will start immediately after.
What is, in your opinion, Trump's approach to the pandemic? We can't understand because he moves each 10 minutes.
I think that the best thing that can happen is that the entourage, the structure that surrounds Trump withstands the insanity of an individual who clearly is not fit for purpose, as we would say in a technological context. I have the lowest possible opinion of the current president of the United States, and therefore I don't think that there's an approach or strategy. There's a more whimsical desire to succeed no matter what. Now, I hope that all the advisors, the government, the infrastructure, the civil servants that support the White House in Washington will manage a crisis that the president is clearly unable to even understand to begin with.
Now, a very Italian question. Do you think that for Italy it would be better a Draghi government or to stay as we are?
I think I will have to be a little bit honest here. Not just any Draghi government, but almost any government. So I think the current government has done a remarkable job, given how it was formed and how it got where it is now. I mean, it was basically unprepared to anything of this magnitude. A Draghi government or a government of high caliber politicians would be what the nation will need to go back to a leadership role. Draghi could be one. I hope there will be others, but we need to start looking in corners that we haven't explored before. Not the usual politicians, not the average sort of member of a party will be able to manage the post-crisis as the post-crisis deserves.
When OMS was announcing pandemic, they underlined one point: all countries must strike a final balance between protecting health, minimizing economic and social disruption, and respecting human rights. What about now about diversity and inclusion and civil rights right in the middle of the crisis?
That's a very good point, actually, and that triangle between rights, economics, and health. So all things that we would like to see maximized, but cannot be maximized at the same time in these circumstances. They seem to be squeezing some corners that even more. Now, imagine, for example, I was just reading recently problems with domestic abuse. Now, this is not a joke, but once you are asked to stay home, and home is exactly where you cannot be, you should not be. Just imagine the tragedy. No, twice as much as anyone else. So diversity, minorities, people who have more problems, more difficulties, less advantages. This is a time where we should be a little bit more concerned about them. An example, supermarkets here have stopped any delivery to anyone who is not registered as either disabled, sort of old, over 70 in this case. So your philosopher, for example, has no chance of having any food delivered at home. I have to go to the supermarket. Why? Well, because other people deserve a better service, not me. I can drive there. I can protect myself. So that is the way of doing things properly. It means that other corners of the world, other corners of society have to make an extra sacrifice so that nothing is, as it were, unfair, entirely on the shoulders of some people rather than spread properly. This is happening all over the place, and in countries where there's less, I'm talking about outside Europe, geographically speaking. Outside Europe, I think that there will be even more suffering from the usual suspects.
What is your opinion about the adoption of an app that can track all of us in Europe, not only in Italy? While here in Italy, they are building up for each village and for each city and for each region, like in Taiwan model.
Yes, well, in a context where there is no longer mobility, a Europe-wide app would probably not be that useful. We're not traveling, say, Milan to Berlin and back, I hope. So the reason why we don't see one, that we don't see proposals about it, is because there is not real mobility at the moment. It would be, on the other hand, quite scary if it were to be introduced as a pseudo-solution to a non-existent problem. In other words, let's build a pan-European app which sort of monitors and checks all its citizens just in case. I would be very much against it. Remember, necessity, proportionality, and deadline. These are the three criteria for a particular sacrifice when it comes to privacy. In this case, there is no necessity.
A last question. There is something we should have asked you and we didn't ask you that you want to say from the digital world we are building.
Maybe there is one point, if I may, that it's a bit more philosophical, so apologies for the non.
That's why I ask you, like Marzullo,
to
put yourself a question and answer.
So this crisis, this tragedy for some countries, especially for Italy, I think has forced the building of awareness that is hugely necessary in life. And I'm talking about awareness about three things: about the past, what other people must have suffered when we read things in books. The influenza, the plague. These are things that today, when you read them, they have a different meaning. So past generation sacrifices, past generation suffering means something completely different today when you read this in your house. Then there's awareness about the present. How much are we now aware? Until recently, we thought that a major problem, the massive difficulty of Italy was that they're growing enough. If only we could go back to those problems, as usual, until we have lost it. So awareness about the present, and still about the present, awareness of what is happening in the rest of the world. Remember, as of today, we're talking about many, many thousands of lives lost because of the virus. It is a tragedy. It's nothing can be said to minimize the impact. More than 10,000 lives lost for a virus is huge. Having said that, just check what happens as we speak when it comes to malaria, something that we could have defeated years ago if only we had wanted. And those 10,000s become negligible. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people dying of malaria. So awareness of that. And this is not meaning that, one pain is bigger than another. Just a wider perspective on how suffering covers much more and more intensely, I'm afraid. And then I would like to end with a positive note, if I may, awareness about the future. Look at what we are able to do when a crisis hits us. There's no problem that humanity cannot solve if it puts itself into it and decides to solve it. So from this crisis onwards, any politicians, any business person who will tell me we can't do it, I will just have to point the finger to what we did when the crisis was over, when the coronavirus was around, and we managed that. We overcame that problem. So from now on, live in memory of this generation, no more excuses for not solving the other problems as soon as this one is over. And that is a positive note. Awareness about what we can do when we do things together. Unstoppable. And that is a lesson for the future. We will get there. Let's not forget it. I would hate to see people forgetting what we can do as a society. And since we badmouthed the President of the United States, let me cite once again the Constitution of the United States. We the people. That is a force that is unstoppable if we put us together.
Okay, thank you. Now I read something that Max Bergami, the dean, is telling you. We don't have to be brave just to change people here, because we understood it's not easy. In behalf of Bologna Business School, the entire University of Bologna, thank you, Professor Floridi, for this exceptional Sunday evening, and we hope to see you soon, hopefully in Bologna. Okay,
with
thank
pleasure.
you.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.